All right, and we're recording, so just a reminder that we're recording today. I want to thank folks for joining in with us. This is our topic is advisory boards, fiduciary boards for your family-owned business. So hopefully you're in the right place. I've got one of our great partners, Drew Larson with BrownWinick, with us today. I was going to talk more about kind of the legal side of setting up a board, why that's important, what kinds of power are you giving up by having a board? What kinds of liabilities are in there? What kinds of paperwork do you need to have around and on file and signed and that kind of thing? We're going to try to keep this to about a half hour. We are recording, and if you have questions, please send those our way. As I said, this is about advisory boards, but I'm using the term advisory board because fiduciary board is a little harder to say for me, but they're interchangeable. They're not interchangeable, and Drew will talk a little bit about the differences, but boards in general are a common element of best practice for family-owned companies. And right before we got on, we were talking a little bit about why, and I'll let Drew share other thoughts that he might have, but I know that a couple of big reasons why we see families go down the path of having a board is because they start to, especially as they grow beyond the first generation, they get into kind of some separation of shareholders. Some are passive shareholders of the business, some are active shareholders of the business, and there can become frankly, some rifts and different things that can come into play, right?
Never seen that ever.
Yeah, I haven't either, but I've just heard about it. Yeah, theoretically. The other theoretical issue is just family dynamics can create other, lots of other conflicts around decision making, and having third party objective folks in the room can kind of help smooth some of those things out. So I would just say those two things as far as maybe why a board is a best practice for a lot of family companies, and I'll let Drew get started and add to that. So thanks, Drew, for being with us.
Our pleasure. So as Dan mentioned, my name is Drew Larson. I'm an attorney here at BrownWinick in Des Moines. Work with lots of closely held business owners across the state and Midwest. I primarily work in like the manufacturing and their supply chain pieces, healthcare provider side for the most part, and technology companies. But through those relationships, I've ended up working with lots of different industries, construction, developers, and others over the years. But really for me, it's about working with family businesses and family business owners. And then if they do decide to go this way, employee-owned businesses as well. There's a little bit in here we will not spend a lot of time on about our firm and me. If you want to learn a little bit about it, you can check it out. But was asked to talk a little bit about advisory board basics. So first of all, there's not that many people on this call. Definitely provide a chat. Like, interruptions are awesome. This should be a conversation if possible. We'll do our best to do that. But I view an advisory board. So in the spectrum of ways you can do governance, right? We started up, there's the founder. I'm going to say dad in the 50s, but maybe dad and mom. And they started the company, and the governance structure was simple. What dad or mom said was what got done, right? As businesses mature, as they grow, that becomes basically a model that doesn't work. Either the span of control, there's not enough hours in the day. No one is awesome at everything. You need different skill sets. And also there's the family transition question. New generations are involved in the business, either as owners or active in the business, but they're not ready, at 21 or 22 to necessarily make all the decisions. But families who are forward-looking want to keep it in the business. They try to find ways and structures to engage, train, and develop that sort of governance structure in those next generation of kids. And that's a common call I get is, all right, I need to start letting go. That's a really hard realization often for the initial founders. But moving into Gen 2 might be pushing for a little more engagement and involvement, and finding ways to do that in a way that doesn't create more conflict than necessary, and also hopefully drives value for the business. I find that it generally does. So we have the sort of one-person show on one end. Then we've got what I'd call the formal board, the fiduciary board. So that is a board required by statute. Every corporation has one. Usually LLCs have something similar, like a board of managers or something. But you can think of them roughly interchangeably. But they have real authority for the company when you're on that board, the fiduciary board. That means that you have real votes. The buck stops with the board of directors for almost all decisions. acquiring companies where you are going to be the survivor, almost always just dealt with by the company. They can usually borrow money. They can do pretty much anything except for sell the company, unless there's some written contracts that limit their authority in some way. But for the most part, they have complete authority to run the business as they see fit and is reasonable. As part of that, since they actually have authority and they actually have duties, they're what's called fiduciaries. I'm actually going to go to the next one. There are two primary fiduciary duties. There's different ways people characterize these, but the big ones, and arguably they cover all of them, are the duty of care and the duty of loyalty. That means that as a director, you have an actual job, and you're responsible for ensuring that job is met. So the duty of care is relatively simple. It says you have to sort of do what a reasonably prudent person would do to make sure that you're making reasonable decisions for the company. You don't always need to be right. It's not to say every bad business decision means you're personally liable, but if you are completely checked out and don't do anything, you've got a problem. You also have a duty of loyalty, conflicts of interest. If you're self-dealing, there's things that limit your ability to do that, or you need to follow certain procedures to get those things approved.
So can you still do business with the company that you're on the board of?
You can, but again, you need to disclose that interest. You don't want to be the one who it's like, oh, we'll use an example. Family businesses almost always rent property from themselves, right? Maybe mom and dad own the business or the real estate, but they've sold the business to the kids or transitioned it to the kids. We're doing that lease. Generally speaking, to meet your fiduciary duties, you need to fully disclose the relationship. It needs to be fair market value generally. And if you can get approved by disinterested directors, then you're generally going to be okay. Now, of course, when you're the only people, mom and dad own it, they own both sides, no one cares. You're not going to complain about yourself, right? But as the business gets more complex, there's more owners, that becomes an issue. But they are elected by the shareholders and owners. That's the formal board. And Tom Walden, who's on this call, sounds like he's served on a number of formal boards, and they have real authority. That this is a meaningful job, and one that has some risk with it, not a ton, but it is real. So I put those out there as the comparisons to then actually talk about the advisory board. I actually think an advisory board is a term that is not like a real term. It is not a legal term. You're not going to go to a statute and be like, here's how you form an advisory board. It is the thing we make up on the internet to talk about all the stuff we do in between one person makes the decision and a real formal board with formal authority, right? So like many blank pages in the world and made up terms, we can make it what we want. So that is a double-edged sword. It's awesome in the sense that we can structure it and build an advisory board to meet many of the needs that families have, while at the same time not necessarily releasing control, giving them any real authority. They are advisors. Just like you hire an accountant, a lawyer, any other advisor, they're advisors to the owners and the decision makers to help them make better decisions. And that tends to be how they're structured. So again, it's an informal thing, provides feedback, ideas, and support to the owners and or leaders. Like I've seen it where it's not the owners, it's the management team that builds their own sort of advisory board that may or may not be family members. But they do not, and this is one of the important things, they will never vote on anything. There's no decisions for them to make. They advise, they do not decide. I find that I get the calls. When do these get used? They get used to help start the process sometimes of these family things, but they're trying to solve the lonely at the top problem. There are some things you cannot talk to your employees about if you are the manager or owner, right? It's just really hard. I've got a really hard strategic decision to make. I've got a really hard decision. Maybe things are going tough and there's a layoff decision. Yes, you should talk to your leadership team, but sometimes it's nice to have someone who's been there, maybe a CEO of another company on an advisory board or something like that, to bounce your ideas off of. Hey, am I missing something? Is there an opportunity? Is there something else I could be considering? Have you been through this? Is there something, oh, you stepped in it last time. I'll guarantee you every other business owner stepped in something. And it's nice to hear those stories before you do it yourself. And then similarly, sometimes we have the yes men problems where someone has been running the company so long, they're doing a great job. It's not even a complaint, but no one, whether it's because of their own behavior or just the nature of they've been doing it so long, no one feels they just don't need to. They will never challenge a decision or a question or question any of the thought processes. Now, we don't want jerks, right? But sometimes you need someone to be like, hey, that didn't make sense to me. Or have you considered this? And that are not in a position of authority, you're not in a position of authority over to give you sort of some honest feedback and ideas on maybe some of those broad things. But it really can be crafted to be what you want it to be and to meet your needs. So if you have a specific issue, family transition, you might have an advisory board of people who've been through there, family business owners who have successfully transitioned.
Yeah.
I work with a lot of startups. They'll have people who do IP or have done software. Like there are other business owners that are doing startups that want to give advice on how that works. Like they have a different need. So you can build this to be really what you want.
Hey, Drew, let's go to some
Yeah.
questions, brother.
Yep.
We got a bunch of them.
Excellent.
I got one to start with on
Good. I
voting.
can't see them. So go ahead. Go for it.
No problem, no problem. I'm reading. I know how to read now. Voting, you said that if you're in a advisory board, which is not a technical legal term, whatever, apparently, but they don't actually vote on things. Can you still ask them to vote on things so that you can use their vote as like a data point with your family? Like, let's say, well, we brought this up to the board, which was increasing the dividend for the company.
Sure.
And the board said, you know what, the vote was 5-2, no. Several of the board members raised concerns about cash flow, let's just say.
Yeah.
Just keep it really simple. Can you do that with an advisory board?
Yeah, sure. You could ask them for their opinion, but they are not going to. The advisory board pieces, they do not want to make what protects them and gives them basically no liability. And also means you didn't give up real control is they don't want to have to make a decision, right? It's not their decision to make. Now, a formal, so I'd say more often, if that's the kind of thing you're looking for, we'll see someone try to bring in some independent directors onto their fiduciary board. But again, you're trying to deal with the family. It is a half political, half emotional, half financial decision. All right, there are three halves there, but you guys have all been there.
Trying to do
So
that.
that is the way these family decisions are made. There's three halves in the
That's
game.
public school math right there.
Exactly. You go to law school for a reason. It's not.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if I quite got what you're saying there. I also went to public school, so you got to say it a little slower for me. But
you could ask an advisory board to vote.
okay.
If you need the cover with your family.
Yes.
But it is important to note, they, as an advisor, one of the things you are protected by is that you are not a fiduciary, meaning you have very little, if any, liability, because you are not making decisions. The more you're going to ask the board to actually make calls and potentially controversial calls, right?
Yeah.
That starts feeling more and more like the fiduciary board and thinking
Okay.
about maybe having some independent directors. Now, as a practical matter, if I were maybe the sole owner and I've got or maybe it's me, I'm the majority, but I've got other family members, siblings or kids or whoever are owners. I can understand why I might go to my advisory board and ask for their vote informally, but something to give me cover if I've decided not to pay, more dividends or whatever it is, because we want to make a reinvestment. We're worried about cash reserves or whatever. So it does give you cover, but it will never be, at the end of the day, it will still be your decision if you're dealing with an advisory board. Whoever had the fiduciary board, which often is just the owner in family held companies, often the founder, that's where the buck will stop.
Okay.
The advisory board. If there's a fiduciary board, you get more cover because there are other people who actually have the authority to make a call.
Okay, so we can ask them to vote on things and we can use that to cover our ass if I'm in the CEO seat, whatever it is. And but as I start to do more and more of that, I'm gonna want to talk to my legal Larry attorney buddy and say, hey, do I need to be looking at us moving to the F word, to fiduciary status?
And you've started using them that way, is really what's happening, is you're starting to move closer and closer to what you would traditionally see a
Right.
board do.
And just to clarify, you can have independent non-family members on an advisory board. As
Oh,
well.
yeah, that's right.
Absolutely.
It can be what you want. It could be all family. I've seen them, I've seen them used as like the training ground for early kids, right? So, hey, we're not going to put you on the formal board yet. It's still my business and I'm gonna make the choice, but I'm gonna have my kids maybe in their 20s. We're gonna do this sort of almost like an exec team, but an advisory board. We're going to bring them in and start having them be part of the discussions.
Yep.
Even if I don't expect them to make the call, I want them to hear
Get them
share some
exposed, right?
feedback, give them some,
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
How about, let's rattle off a few of our other questions from the audience. So when you're if you're on an advisory board, someone asks you to be on their advisory board, are you taking on any real legal risk for yourself to be on that board?
Excellent question. Liability of advisors. See, I thought this one
Oh,
might come
crap.
up.
Okay,
See, look at that. I have my moments where I actually, can think ahead on it, which is nice. Like, that's a good sign that the questions are relevant. So because the advisory board, they are not actually agents, they can't take an action for the company, and they're not fiduciaries. They're not making decisions as real fiduciary directors. They have basically no liability. It's very hard to show that they have actually done anything that would be harmful to the company because they haven't made any decisions. They gave some advice. It could be garbage, but they didn't make the call.
okay.
Right. I will say it is, as a practical matter, if I were on an advisory board, and generally speaking, they still often ask for indemnification from the company on the same basis that any director or officer would get. So God forbid they do get drug into a suit, that kid who wanted bigger dividends is mad. And they're like, well, the advisory board voted. The advisors are all gonna be like, yeah, what did that mean? Right? It's, I said what I thought, but I didn't actually make the call. I don't know why I'm in this suit. The company would still have to defend them. So that's a very common ask by them. But as a practical matter, their liability is very, very little. Once you're a formal fiduciary, you're making decisions and your vote matters, then you have a higher level of potential exposure.
Okay, okay. Now I know this presentation isn't to get in depth on fiduciary, but it sounds like if I'm on a board, someone asked me to be on their board, I should say, hey, is this fiduciary or just kind of a board?
Yep.
And they
Yeah.
say it's just kind of a board. I'm gonna say, yeah, I can do that, but could you make sure to put my name on your D&O insurance?
Yep.
Okay,
A little something saying, yeah, I'm going to indemnify you for this stuff.
sort of cover my ass type of thing.
That's
Okay,
exactly right.
all right,
And
cool.
there's low exposure, so it's generally like if I were the company side attorney, I'd be like, yeah, not a problem here.
Perfect.
Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
I'll let you go back to where you were.
So we'll see. I think I'll probably cover some of the questions, but one of the steps was like, how do you create an advisory board? Again, there's lots of flexibility of what you want, but find trusted people with relevant knowledge and the experience that you will listen to. That's sort of the external looking one. If it's family, obviously, it's the family. But one of the hardest things is if they don't have real authority, which is fine, you want to be the person who's where the buck stops. You still want to have people that you will actually listen to. If you're not, there's no point in getting together in a room, getting a whole bunch of advice that you promptly ignore, right? So you want them to be people that you respect, trust, and have relevant knowledge. This is not necessary because these are informal. It can just be like, I've got this advisory group. We meet at the Panera every 3 months, right? And I'll buy you breakfast. And honestly, that's not that different. I actually looked for a Godfather photo of like the Godfather and the consiglieres in the booth. Like advisory board, like sure, if I were to write an article about it, that looks like an advisory board to me, an interesting business, one that's illegal, but basically functioning that way, right? I actually like communicating terms if you're going more formal, meaning like the length of time, because these are people you tend to like and respect, but they may not all work out. And communicating a term gives you an easy out, like, hey, it's been a year, I renew, but like, I'm just not going to ask you back, right? Thank you for your year of service. Instead of having to potentially offend by being like, you're out, right?
You could get much more formal than that even too.
You
and
can.
having terms and having elections and.
Yep.
And
I would probably say elections.
committee.
Yeah, elections would be weird, like, because again, you're not like who elects them. They have no real authority, but who's the picker? Like who wants the board, the advisory board? But yeah, generally speaking, there wouldn't be elections. If you're going that far, you're probably ending up at the fiduciary side. The last thing on this list was the confidentiality. Almost always you're going to be sharing real things about your business. So at a minimum, I will tell you, I see plenty of these that are basically handshakes and they are just meeting at the Panera or whatever some morning, once a month. But if you're getting anything more formal than that, and you're going to share like, hey, I'm going to send you out a packet, before our meeting with our quarterly financials and that, getting a confidentiality agreement is probably what I'd say is the baseline expectation of advisors. Like they should say they're going to maintain your stuff in confidence. You should feel comfortable that you can share openly with them whatever's going on and what you need advice about. Sometimes, depending on the situation, you'll see IP assignment or non-compete language as well. I would say if I see those, not always, but frequently I view those as overkill. This advisor is not in the weeds enough to actually compete with you, right? Like you're giving them high level stuff. I'm facing this market issue, whatever, but they're generally not in a position where it's like, you have access to our customer list and you can go compete against me, or you have all of our actual designs, right? They just tend to not have the kind of info that would make them,
But
unfair
maybe
for
you've
them.
got a family member that is saying, hey, make sure these buttholes don't become our competitor someday, right? So maybe there's a cover my butt for that.
Yeah, so every once in a while you want to cover that. If you're like a early stage inventive type company, or you want an advisory board to help you with like your R&D process. Again,
Yeah.
not always, but you might have someone like an IP assignment. They're going to want it to be narrow because these people you want as advisors tend to be involved with multiple things. They're not just in one deal, right? So you'll have to think about how to narrow that. But those are things that you might ask. If it's more of a financial and general business one, the IP assignment usually isn't something that you need, but it might come up.
Okay.
Expectations and compensation. I'm a big believer, again, in set expectations. If you want people to perform and you want to get out of them whatever it is you're seeking, right? That feedback, that regular guidance, that peer network, whatever it is, communicate the time and engagement expectations up front. It's shocking, but like if you tell them what you expect, it's better to get a no if they can't deliver than to get a yes and then they fail, right? Like then all of you lose and everyone's bitter about it. I'd say it's hard to ask an advisor to do more than monthly meetings. I'd say most are quarterly, but monthly at the most. Some people feel very strongly. They'll do most of our advisor meetings are going to be remote, right? And I'm recruiting everywhere. Others, they feel like it's really, they're going to share hard things and have hard conversations. They want to do it in person if possible, or at least some of the meetings in person. And then also we have some advisors, again, these tend to be ones where you have more specific problem or earlier stage, but they might say, I want to be able to call you, right, with a question in between meetings if there's something.
Yeah.
Is that something you plan on doing a lot, a little bit? Now, most of these people will still pick up the phone, but if you call them every day, they're going to be like, what did I get myself into, right? This isn't worth the stipend for the meeting, right? One of the questions in the summary of the presentation is, how do you compensate these people? Well, again, part of that really depends on what this looks like, what you're trying to achieve, and how formal you're getting. If you're asking, what I'd say is like my startups, theirs is basically the pizza and beer, like come move my furniture type of approach, where like, again, you meet, you buy a meal, and that's your, you get feedback. They really enjoy this, but it's not a huge time commitment. A couple hours every quarter, people will do that, drop a phone call or whatever. If you're asking people to come to your facility, we want to meet monthly, quarterly, more like a traditional board or fiduciary board. We start seeing meeting stipends, right? So compensating for their time and sort of the opportunity cost. Again, the people you ask to be on these tend to be people who are busy and have plenty of other things to do. So you at least want to make it like maybe not worth their time. It's rarely the most profitable thing being on a board, but it's not nothing, right? Like make sure it's not a loss for them every time they come and deal with you.
Oh yeah, I see people use like, what do we pay our CEO?
Yep.
And look at dividing that out at a daily pay and using that as some level of a guideline for paying these folks who you hold in the same kind of esteem and have the same kinds of backgrounds, and let's make sure we're treating them with that kind of respect. So
yeah, and that is again, some people really enjoy this, and it's, if it's across town, that's different than if you've got a board that's spread across the region, for example, that you want to come in. Almost always they cover travel, if you want to come in the night before and do a hotel, right? Buy a nice dinner or lunch, but usually there's some sort of stipend if it's getting more formal. Then I will see some, whether this is more common on fiduciary boards and not with family companies, admittedly. So, but we will see sometimes equity compensation, right? Some sort of stock option or other things where maybe it's a high growth company or high growth potential. Maybe you've got a subsidiary that you got this high growth thing. There's the family business, but there's the high growth business that we need support for. Sometimes you can do things like that where the equity comps at one level, but that's rarer in the family business context, definitely, but not completely unheard of. Much more common in other contexts.
Maybe before we go on here,
go for it.
we could get, I know Tom is on with us and he's
please
on a couple of family boards. Tom, would you mind sharing a little bit of your kind of firsthand knowledge of being on a board as far as what maybe, what you see as the benefit you're providing to that family and why you've chosen to invest some time into doing that?
Yeah, sure. Great. Can you hear me okay? Because I've been on mute and on my camera off. No, great. I think I really enjoy it. I think the benefit I bring is an outside perspective to the board. I think it's important that you get to know the people in the company to be effective. I think that Drew did a great job of explaining things. I'm involved. My involvement is I always want to deliver more than what the people involved expect from me. What I do is quarterly meetings face to face. I go to their quarterly meeting. There's an agenda. There's a board packet. It's a pretty real live board meeting. And monthly, I spend time. I at least talk to the CEO once a month. What's going on? I think to be effective at a board meeting, I need to have a working knowledge of what are the issues inside the company. I also am mentoring a person within their company right now at the same time. So I'm fine with the amount of time that I'm involved. I don't think I can be effective unless I have an understanding of what's going on inside their business and their company, and helping through they've hired some key people. They've made a few strategic changes. I should probably have introduced myself a little more. I worked for 3M for 35 plus years. I've been on a internal board acquisition within 3M. I've been on a couple family boards, and I've been on a private equity board, and I've been on a nonprofit board, and they all operate a little bit differently. I think one of the keys I wanted to suggest is that if you're considering a board person, they really need to be able to connect with different generations of your company. I think if it's okay to have them come meet people and talk to people and talk about your expectations, as this slide says, set expectations. Talk about what you're looking for, because if the board member is really upfront and they say, well, I can't do any of that for you, they should, and not just do it just for the exercise. I think it's important to find board members that can come at the minimum of twice a year, but 4 times a year would be ideal, I think, to your business. So
yeah. Oh,
feel free to, I know our time will be limited. It's not that hard to find me on LinkedIn if you want to discuss something one-on-one. I'd be more than happy to do that.
Cool. Thanks, Tom. Thanks for being with us and kind of sharing a little bit of do you find yourself in situations, especially on family boards, where you're there to kind of be a buffer, or, as my wife always calls it, the voice of reason, to talk about
yes, and I'm very fortunate that the board that I'm on, one of the boards I'm on, there are generational voices of reason involved in that board also, and there's a lawyer involved. So I think if you've got a lawyer, maybe it's not the lawyer you use for day to day, but you need to have a lawyer that's actually familiar with board work. And yes,
okay.
I can raise issues that the other family members cannot. I'm just fortunate that the board is well structured. They have entrance requirements for family members on, how do I get involved in the family business? Well, there's hurdles to get over to get into the family business, not just your last name.
Yep. But
And that's a whole nother presentation, probably.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
But board structure is really important, like Tom mentioned. And when I set up formal boards with independent directors, it's often to deal with that issue, right? So like a compensation committee, the family setting the comp for their relatives gets really touchy, right? And having an independent set of directors to help do that. So Tom, I would almost guarantee, we've never talked about this, but I almost bet you're on the compensation committee or something like that in some of these boards.
And it's interesting, because I think another thing to consider that, the things that I've learned that I didn't know going in, make decisions when the business is running really well, because they'll be so much easier to get agreement on, either formal and informal. I mean, it's selling your plan to your stockholders is the same as selling it to your board. Is like, if you want to put hurdles in place for hiring relatives, do it when they're getting good equity checks.
Mhm.
Yeah. Or when their kids are 3 or 4 years old and you're not really too concerned about it being in, it's not a thing on the front of your mind.
Well, set the standard when it's not clear that it's applying to a particular person, right? If it's, I'm dealing with brother Kyle, and Kyle is like, that is my brother, like, when it's about that person, it gets very different. But when it's, hey, we don't know who's going to be involved in the business in 10 years, but we agree that we want our owners or our board members to be active in the business, right? So we're going to set that standard. And then we all agree that makes sense right now. We're going to see how that actually works out, but we don't know who's going to be on which side of the table in the long run.
Sure, yeah. Okay.
Any other questions for me? I know we're on a time clock.
Yeah, I mean, I know we're gonna spill over a little bit. This is a really critical topic, and we are recording, which is very unique for us. But we're doing that because we're kind of putting this out there as a resource, so we don't want anybody asking questions that are gonna be that they want to keep confidential. So appreciative of the kind of questions we've gotten this far, and I'll let Drew kind of keep going with his next slide. Is it okay?
Yeah, I'm keeping it pretty close. So again, talking advisory boards, not fiduciary boards, because they're not people with real authority and they haven't been like elected by the shareholders in a formal way. Guess what? You can pretty much get rid of them however you want, right? Like, I'm tired of this. Don't like the board anymore. You just stop calling them, right? I don't hold meetings. You're just done. So again, very flexible in a lot of ways. They're not employees. There's no specific procedures. Now, if you had like, I can imagine someone building up an advisory board that is almost as formal as a formal board. So maybe you have some procedures or rules, right? Maybe you have a contract. You want someone to sign on as an advisor. I see this mostly when there's like equity comp, where there's something that's more complex being involved with a participant, so less likely in family businesses. You have to follow whatever you contractually agreed to with them, right? Pay or otherwise. But short of that, they're there because you want them there. And if you don't want them there, they're gone. Like, they don't have a role. They're not employees. They're not protected by any of the employee stuff. You can be
Okay,
done.
perfect.
It's that easy.
And
We talked about that.
how about
Actually,
expenses?
last slide. Go ahead.
Mr. Accountant, I know you've got a CPA as well, Drew, so these.
Not formally,
expenses-
I took enough credits. I did not take all the exams.
Oh, okay.
So, but have an accounting
Okay,
background,
there's
yep.
your legalese on that, I guess.
That's right. I didn't want to claim that I was out there claiming
Good
to be as
grief.
prestigious as a
Okay,
CPA.
okay.
I'm very much bottom of the barrel with the JD.
Let's go with all these expenses we're talking about, paying for their travel, sending them documents, paying them to come to our meetings, going out to dinner. That's all expense, business
Yep.
expense, I assume, right?
All legitimate business expense. That's why you're dealing with them. That's why you're trying to, you want their advice and you're paying them for the advice like any other contractor or advisor.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Keep going.
So this is the last slide. I sort of wanted to say, like, what might you see? So I actually had typed it in to start and took it out, but I'll be honest, a lot of the advisory, what I would call like real advice, like advisory boards that maybe are just happening, they're mostly handshakes or a letter. Hey, I'll agree, like, we want to be on my advisory board. The deal is we do quarterly meetings. I'll pay you $1,000 a pop, right? But I'd really appreciate it if you join. And someone says yes, and then they start showing up and you pay them the $1,000, right? Like,
Okay,
real legal, right? But it is like, because you can get rid of them because you just send them the invites, you do what you said you're going to do, right? But as mentioned earlier, I would almost always get that confidentiality agreement. So if you're going to be sharing private things about your business, right, may involve like big questions about employees, like, are we going to do, I might have to lay off, like, how have you guys dealt with this, right? Getting a confidentiality agreement is valuable, financial stuff like that. If you're going to move up the formality ladder, so you're expecting more out of them, you're going to offer them, more comp or different comps or whatever, maybe an advisor agreement that sets forth those expectations, right? I would say I probably do those in 10 to 15% of the time, right? Like, so this is really confidentiality agreement, like 100%. Advisor agreement, like, we've dropped off a lot. But if you really are trying to make it more formal, but you're not quite ready to go all the way to the fiduciary board, an advisor agreement might make sense. It's going to look very similar to what an agreement a board member might sign as an independent director.
yeah, okay.
That's where you'd see that indemnity for D&O, directors and officers type stuff, like it would tend to be in there. And then lastly, if you're doing equity comp, there's lots of documentation that goes with that to do it well. And then lastly, I noted this is not a legal document. You probably don't even need to call your lawyer about it, though they might have some thoughts that are valuable. But if you're trying to build sort of an institutional thing that's, it's part of that communicating expectations, I have encouraged, and I've seen some people do like an advisory board charter, similar to like a family governance plan or charter that you might see in some other contexts. The idea being we want to communicate expectations. What are the kinds of things that are going to come up here? How are we going to try to pick people? So maybe the shareholders want to see an advisory board, or maybe the CEO wants to set up an advisory board and takes it to their normal board of directors, say, this is what I'm trying to set up to support me in my operations and my job. So that's sort of the way I would say we look at that. So that's optional, but it might help the company and the person who wants the advisory board start clarifying and narrowing their thoughts down. What is it I'm looking for? What am I trying to achieve? What do I need to do to accomplish those objectives?
Okay.
That's the whole presentation. And I'm going to say that wasn't too bad. I think, we did a few of the questions during, but I actually hit my 30 minutes, I think.
I'll give you
Dan knows that's very rare for all of you on the call, like actually.
especially when it's billing time. Yeah, exactly.
Thanks for that, Dan. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Let's talk about a couple things there before we completely wrap up. And please also ask any questions that you might have. Drew, I'm first going to put you on the spot and say maybe we need to do something on fiduciary boards.
I would say so. Yep.
Yeah.
Given the questions in the discussion here, I think that family board governance is a really interesting topic that has a lot of value. And every family is different, and so is every answer there, but there are some tools that can be used. And I've done a presentation a little on this before in some other contexts, but there's sort of we want everyone to end up owning the business. And then we want to have a structure that allows that and also has good governance. That's sort of one end of the spectrum. And then we tend to have another end, which is only people in the business are ever going to own this. But then we need a governance structure between them. And so there's overlap there, but those are very different modalities of how they approach business and family ownership and legacy. There's no right or wrong answer.
Yeah, both are common.
That's right. But once you pick the direction, you want to be thoughtful about how then you manage that to make sure that as you move further down in generations, you don't create more conflict than you need to.
Sure. So if we talk, so you just kind of outline some of these differences, advisory versus fiduciary. One thing that can be a very similar process is going through who do we put on our board, right? And we help families that are in our membership kind of find board members and go through what we call a board member matrix. And, it's kind of looking at what kind of industry knowledge do we want for our board members to have, thereby what kind of connections are they going to bring to us and that kind of thing, and expertise that maybe we can't hire full-time right now. So we want somebody who has some international trade experience, but we don't have the bandwidth to have an international trade expert on staff, right? Those kinds of things are ways that we look at who we put on the board. There was one question about internal employees, specifically calling out kind of putting your CFO on your board, which I think is fairly common, but maybe not.
I would say probably not, but what I would say is that so again, on an advisory board, probably not. I think they're part of your leadership team. They're going to be very involved. They might be attending the advisory board meetings because you want them engaged in the process, but usually they're not actually a formal member of your board.
Okay, so they're maybe coming to present their financials to the board, take questions, educate the board on the financial situation, and then they're maybe, out the door because you want to keep some separation of church and state and that kind of thing.
And to the point that to the extent I've been on boards, which I have, mostly nonprofits, right? I always like to have this. I think the CEO and the CFO are sort of the key leadership team members.
Sure.
Generally needs to have a relationship with. Technically, the CFO generally reports to the CEO, but they just have such a critical piece of the actual information that their involvement is really important in strategic level discussions and decision making.
Okay.
But again, their boss is the board. So often you don't put them in a position to be their own boss. Now, public companies, sometimes the CEO has a board seat and other things. And the family member employees often have board seats. But for the independent ones, I'd say generally speak, other employees that are not family members Generally, they won't serve on the board, but they are
Okay.
going to be involved in that process. Viewing the board as a broader leadership group.
Okay, okay. So we keep it to owners and we keep it to maybe true outsiders with expertise. However, we might engage employees to give presentations, maybe
Yeah.
on a new product line or on the financial situation or.
Or let's just say we're talking about a new plant expansion or business line expansion, right? How can you have that conversation at the board level for a yes or no vote without really having the CFO?
Yeah,
and the
I would
CEO?
think that shows your key employees that, hey, we're more than just me and me deciding on my whims, what I want to do, but I've got this cadre of educated folks listening and guiding. And Tom, I don't know if you can still, if you're still on and with us, but I don't know if you could comment for a minute just on the kind of makeup that's on the family boards you serve on and that part of it as far as having different backgrounds and things like that.
Sure. On both boards, I've been the only external person, and it's largely, I mean, I would never anticipate that a family board would have more voting board members that have no stock than family members. I guess I'm not saying, maybe I'm not saying that exactly correctly, but
The family
Just for
holds the majority, basically always.
yeah, the family, I mean, you know, a fiduciary board, but the family still controls all the stock, and they're gonna, or the, just by the way it's set up, they're gonna make the final decisions where there's votes that show the rest of the family members that there's due diligence that goes on. I think that it's always a little bit different. I mean, I think that something we've spent a lot of time on is around capital and spending money on a plant expansion, things like that. An acquisition was a large part of the discussion at some point. Are you guys still there? I'm starting to lose you.
No, we're here, yeah.
Okay. No, I'm just rambling a little bit. I mean, I think that
Oh,
they're just they're good boards that have good execution involved. So
sure. No, I appreciate it. Thanks, Tom. So maybe Drew, we'll do something on fiduciary here at some point in the near
Yeah.
future but with that said, I don't want to say that, I don't want the takeaway from this to be, well, if I'm going to do a board, that's where I should start. I think maybe if you're going to do a board, this is where you should start with an advisory type of concept first, right?
I have an in-between feeling. Like, I think there's a perception that the minute you have a real board, you've given up a lot. But like Tom already mentioned, if you're 100% shareholder or your group owns, usually a majority is enough, but whatever the threshold is, if you don't like the board, you get rid of the board, right? Like, it's still the shareholder's company. You're hiring these people. I say hiring loosely, but you're picking these people on the fiduciary side to make decisions because you think they're going to make the best decisions for the business, right? And you as the shareholder. So if you stop believing that, you get rid of them. So there's sort of like the blend there where the right time is. You can structure your board of directors in a way that seems a little like we talked about in the advisory side now, like where we're going to slowly step it in and all that. You can build your advisory more complex so it looks more like a fiduciary board, even if it isn't.
Yeah.
There's probably I would say by the time, if you really are super nervous about having a board and some independent stuff, test what it would look like with an advisory board, right? It can be relatively informal. See what you think. Like, put those kind of questions in front of them, see the kind of response you get, see how thoughtful they are. Most of the time you're going to find, oh, that was actually a really useful experience. Not always, but usually. And you got what you needed. But it can help people overcome that initial hesitance to let someone else have a say in your business. Because it is, I mean, that's a big deal. And it's
Sure.
it's a hard thing to do.
No, yeah. Try before you buy a little bit. kind of
Yes,
thing.
exactly. Give it the test drive.
Yeah. Tom, you want to go ahead and mention whatever you might have to? Maybe Tom froze up here. So, well, with that, I want to thank Drew. I think we got a lot of things out there on the legal side. It sounds like, if we're going to do this advisory board, just to kind of recap, correct me where I'm wrong here, Drew, but identify the people we want to ask, make sure we've got some good diversification of backgrounds and ages and stages. Some folks maybe from family businesses as a background would be great in our case, obviously, with this type of work. Somebody who's maybe been in the CEO's role or who is in the CEO's role for another family-owned company, something like that. So going through, figuring out who we're going to get, having them sign a confidentiality agreement as a month,
Baseline, yep.
probably. And potential, figuring out what we're going to pay them and knowing that we can stop paying them and stop having them and stop listening to them at any time. And if we want to do some informal votes on things, to kind of use as another buffer against, to protect me against my nephew, Jimmy, or whoever else in the company thinks I'm making poor decisions, we can do some of that with the advisory board. Give that a run, see how it goes, and see what kind of benefits we're getting out of it for the family and the business, and then maybe get more serious about becoming fiduciary in nature. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay. All right. Awesome. Drew, appreciate your time. Tom,
a
appreciate
pleasure,
your
everyone.
time as well. We'll do something again, and appreciate people being on today. As a reminder, we did record this and we'll get this up on the site here eventually. So thanks, everybody. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Tom.